Our ministry has found a great partner with Cash App to send money and spend using the Cash Card while spreading our message. Try it using our code and you'll get $5 too. Check the link below and support this ministry. All right, Tom, thanks for joining. You had reached out and shared with me your book. When did you actually write that book?
Yeah, the book, Trump's Second Term, I began writing it a little over a year ago in February of 2020 and completed it in probably May of 2020. So it was all before the election. And when I started writing it, there was still a good possibility that Trump could be reelected. And even as you went into the fall and Biden was up by 8 points, it still wasn't clear that it was a slam dunk for him because Hillary was up by 17 points at the same period in 2016.
Oh yeah, we all thought that Hillary was going to win, and even I've shared on some past episodes. Social media was a different place. Back when Trump was running against Hillary, and a lot of people were biting their tongue back then, and all of these deplorables were doing what they were doing, and it was a different place. And then of course everybody was shocked that he won, and the term, went out just exactly how we thought it would. What actually led you to write the book there?
Well, part of it was I had just read, or I had just seen Philip Roth, The Plot Against America, which speculated what would have happened if Lindbergh had won the election in 1940 as opposed to Roosevelt. How would America have been different? And I thought, what happens if Trump is reelected? What would America look like in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the economy, in terms of social justice? And what I came to the conclusion is I started to extrapolate and expand. If Trump does what he's doing now and continues in a second term, what would that look like? And in Trump's America, nobody can sit on the sidelines. Everybody's got to take a stand, and there'd be a lot of people that would support him and a lot of people who would be against him and try and get rid of him. And one of the major learnings of the book was that once you're elected, it's very difficult and almost impossible to get rid of a president once he or she has been elected.
Yeah, we found that out the hard way, for sure. And the book, just so that we're clear, some may have been distracted before they got into the episode here. Trump's second term, What If President Donald J. Trump Had Won Re-Election in 2020? It's available probably most anywhere. It's ebook, paperback, and so forth. And Tom, I'll let you pronounce your last name. I don't want to murder it.
It's Fishgrund. So, I think that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah, fair enough. And then we were talking earlier, Tom, so you're in Metro Atlanta now, but were you native Metro Atlanta?
No, I actually grew up in New York, did my schooling in Boston. There wasn't a college or university I didn't go to in Boston, and then came down to Atlanta actually to work for Coca-Cola. And I worked 15 years for Coke, and the past 20 years I've been doing an executive search business. I'm a headhunter, a recruiter. But I've written 7 books, and I enjoy writing, and this is my first work of fiction, and was just kind of fascinated by this whole question of what if Trump had been reelected? What would America look like?
Yeah, and it's almost similar as you describe it, and as I read through it. Have you heard of The Man in the High Castle?
Yeah, it's the same kind of book. There are other books like What If the South Had Won the Civil War? And what's interesting when you're writing this kind of book, and especially when you're writing about Trump, I tried to think about what would be really outlandish, what would be, really crazy, what are the crazy things that he could do? And as it turned out, the one mistake that I made was I didn't even think crazy enough. Because if I had told you in December that the President of the United States would encourage a insurrectionist mob to take over the Capitol to try and prevent the certification of the next election, you'd say, well, that's crazy. That would never happen. The police, the Capitol Police, the National Guard, the military, the FBI, Secret Service, they'd never let that happen. But the bottom line is it did happen. And as I looked at kind of thinking through, what would the difference be? The first major difference is I don't think that Trump would have done nearly as good a job with the pandemic. He did a terrible job while he was in office. But you got to remember that in December, Trump said, we're going to vaccinate 20 million people. And it turned out that the U.S. actually vaccinated 3 million people. Trump left it up to the states and the local government to handle. When Biden takes over, in the first 100 days, he vaccinates 220 million people. So, first of all, assume that the pandemic is not going to be handled well by Trump in a second term. And that also has implications in terms of the economy, because then the economy's not going to do well. And so if the economy doesn't do well, then how does that affect ordinary people? And then you've got to think about, but what about the social justice? Trump did not care about social justice. That was not a big thing with Trump, and that was never. So I think what I predicted would have happened in his second term, would there be a lot of protest out throughout the country. But instead of being about social justice, they'd be about there's an authoritarian dictatorship that is taking over this country. And people are going to take to the streets and try and get rid of Trump. And at the same time, Trump, if you thought that Trump was terrible in the first term, you can only imagine that he would have taken his election in the second term as a mandate, and then would have, first of all, in order to put down the protests, would have called out the National Guard, and the National Guard would have put down the protest because he would have declared a state of emergency. And if you remember back in the summer of 2020, when Trump went across Lafayette Square to hold up a Bible in front of a church, and the National Guard and the military put down the protesters, these were peaceful protesters, but they started firing rubber bullets at them, and they started moving them away. Just imagine that multiplied and magnified many times during Trump's second term.
Oh, for sure. It was scary as hell. Some of the actions and using the military against, citizens within the country. It was scary as hell.
And what I predict would have happened would be that Trump would have suspended habeas corpus, the right to a speedy and fair trial. He would have arrested or put under house arrest governors and senators for their own protection. And he would have focused in on solidifying his rule during the second term. And there's even a question about, well, if he won a second term, would he stop? Would he therefore potentially go on for a third term in 2024? And you're saying, well, what about the 22nd Amendment, which prevents a president from running again? And what I predicted is that, first of all, Trump would have another two picks at the Supreme Court. In fact, he had one of them at the end of 2020 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. What I predicted at that point was that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg left office, that Trump would replace her with a female who I said would be anti-abortion, would be a right-wing conservative, who would make Gorsuch and Kavanaugh sound like liberals. And that's exactly what happened. And so Trump would therefore have not only the Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but it's questionable whether Stephen Breyer will serve out another 4 years. And so you would have a court that's 7-2 in a conservative bent, and it would be hard to stop Trump from a legal perspective to do anything with the Supreme Court that's configured in that way.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind, have you seen the documentary on HBO, Q, Into the Storm?
No.
You've heard of QAnon, right?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a documentary. I think I need to catch up on a few more episodes because they were dropping them, I think, once a week. But HBO did a documentary, and they went back to the roots, allegedly, because QAnon allegedly is, anonymous and so forth. And they go back to the roots and how it started out on these message boards and so forth. And there are a lot of parallels. I'm almost drawing some parallels that you may be actually the liberal QAnon here. I don't know.
What's amazing is that I took like one day while trying in 2020, and Trump did three things, any one of which would have been an outrage with any other president or major political leader, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because in one of them, Trump praises QAnon supporters and says that he appreciates them and that they like me very much. So first of all, a radical group which believes in the Democrats are committing pedophilia and doing all these terrible things, he supports them. The other thing that he said on that same day was that it was reported that he wanted to swap Puerto Rico for Greenland. And I'm thinking, God, where did that come from? And then finally, he was asked by a reporter whether he would accept the election results after the election, and he kind of demurred and hesitated and never said that he would accept the results. And in fact, he didn't. And in my book, he never accepts any election results. And without giving away my ending, there is an election result which doesn't go his way in 2024, and he doesn't accept it. And then what happens? And how does that eventually resolve itself? And so there are so many issues. And the amazing thing is that as I look at this, about what happens to America, you got to take it down to the personal level. Because if you look at The Man in the High Castle and The Plot Against America, it's about a family. And there's a family in Atlanta where the father is very much in favor of Trump because he works for a fintech company. He's got a good job. He's making $200,000. He lives in Buckhead. And he believes that Trump is doing a good job. And when people say, well, you don't agree with his style, he says, well, his bark is worse than his bite. And his wife is against Trump. His kids are against Trump. But this guy, John Gillespie, likes Trump. And it's only when certain things start to happen that he begins to evolve. First of all, as Trump starts to round up illegal immigrants, it doesn't bother most people because it doesn't affect them. And Stalin used to say, if 11 million people die, it's a statistic. If one person dies, it's a tragedy. And it's not until John Gillespie's cleaning lady, who's an illegal immigrant, gets picked up in one of these sweeps. So then he begins to say, well, maybe Trump's not such a good guy. And so the second thing that happens to him, which I think would be a very real possibility, is that he loses his job. And then all of a sudden, the good life that Trump has promised is no longer available to him. So then he starts to become, well, now I'm not believing that Trump is as good a guy as I think he is, and starts to go against Trump. But it's the final straw that really forces him to become anti-Trump. And that is that he's at a protest rally with his wife and his two children who are college students, and the National Guard is very aggressive, starts arresting people and holding them without trials, without anything. And John and his wife are running down a street to avoid the National Guard, and all of a sudden they realize that their kids aren't there, and then they find out their kids have been arrested. And it's at that point, when his kids are arrested, that John Gillespie says, no, Trump's not a good guy. I am totally against him, and how do I prevent him from continuing in office? And the book covers legislative remedies, legal remedies, the 25th Amendment, where you declare the president incapable of holding office anymore, assassinations, etc. And you even have foreign powers that become involved. So it's very, very difficult to get a president out of office, but it also affects us. And a lot of the characters in the book have moral dilemmas about whether they should follow their job or follow their conscience. And that's what a lot of the book is about. Kind of what do you do when you have an autocrat in office? And do you take the law into your own hands? Do you start to make certain decisions? Those are some of the judgments and some of the decisions that people must make.
One thing that shocked me, because leading up to the election, everybody was on pins and needles. Our blood pressure was all rise. It's just drama everywhere, and everybody was worried about the results. When we finally got the results, who decided to wake up and vote for Trump that did not vote for him the first time around? And I don't know if your book goes into that, or if there's an angle of the story anywhere in there, but more people voted for Trump the second time around than they did the first time around. I've been struggling trying to answer that.
I really kind of thought through, was there a real possibility that Trump could have been elected, and were there enough people? And you got to remember that 75 million people voted for him the second time. And you kind of thought, at what point, what's the red line that Trump can cross so that people won't support him? And you can denigrate a war hero. You can call white supremacists, they're good people on both sides. You can get them cozying up to Russia. And none of those were red lines. And what I kind of found frightening as I did research for the book and then kind of as I've been thinking about it afterwards, was that Trump only lost the election. He lost the election by like 7 or 8 million votes. But because of the electoral college system, if only 3 states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, had flipped 105,000 votes out of over 155 million cast, if 105,000 votes had gone the other way, then Trump would have been reelected. And what was kind of almost more frightening is that it was within Trump's control to do that. And he had a pollster, a guy named Stepien, who said to him, you only got to do a few things. First thing you got to do is recognize that the pandemic is something that's really serious, and you're going to take control, which Trump never did. The second thing he said is you have to, as president, act presidential. And so when he went off on Biden in the first debate, that caused him a lot of votes. And the third thing, which was most incredible, was he said the election was rigged, there was fraud, and he didn't want his supporters to go out and vote via the mail. And those 3 things probably, and I would say almost certainly, cost him the election. But one could argue that you got to dance with the girl you brought to the dance, and Trump couldn't change. And because Trump couldn't change, that's what cost him the election. But I still can't believe that there are 75 million people that supported him, given all the things that he did. And if you look at now, there's a fight within the Republican Party where they are fighting out whether Trump is going to control the party. And from everything that I'm reading, and it's instructive that Liz Cheney, who is opposed to Trump, is going to lose her leadership position. So Trump still has a great sway and control of the Republican Party. And I think what's happening is there is a certain angst in America among white working class people, and Trump is able to tap into that better than almost anybody else has. He understands it, feels with it, and even though it's based on lies, and even though his policies don't really help these people, there are enough people that like his kind of screw you attitude and giving the finger to the establishment. It's beyond me, but it's still a very viable and still frightening events that people do support him in spite of everything he says and does. And in his second term, it becomes even more frightening. And you've got to sit there and say, oh, my God, how do we get rid of this guy?
Yeah, well, it's clear that the Republican Party is a regime. And and to even further this point, if you look up the definition of regime, it's a government, especially an authoritarian one. And it's very clear that you either are on the Republican bus or you're not on the Republican bus. And that's what they're doing to Liz Cheney. You either, march with them or they're going to find a way to get rid of you. And, sorry.
I'm so sorry. Well, they've marginalized Mitt Romney. They've marginalized Liz Cheney. And there was an election in Texas where, for one of the congressmen who had died of COVID, a Republican, and there were like 10 people, 8 to 10 people in the election, and 2 of them who were big Trump supporters got 65% of the vote. There was one Republican who was a serviceman, small business owner, kind of the prototypical person that you'd expect to do well, and he was anti-Trump, and he got 3% of the vote. And I think that says it all, that the grassroots really does support this guy.
Yeah, and it's scary, for sure.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And, to add back to the Republican Party, I'm in District 11. So you mentioned earlier you're more east of here. I assume your rep is Lucy McBath over in your area, right?
Yeah, Lucy McBath, yes.
Yeah. So a little bit over here, too. I'm literally across the street from District 6, which is your district over there. I have District 11, which is Barry Loudermilk. And then further to the west of us, we have lovely Marjorie Taylor Greene at 14. And but basically, if you put Barry Loudermilk and Marjorie Taylor Greene together, they're basically the same. It's just that Marjorie can't shut her mouth. And one of the ideas, and you've done it, and I have another author that I've done an episode with, and we're going to do another episode this Saturday with a gentleman that's running against Barry Loudermilk. And it's an idea that I've done before, and it's come up again because we're going to have another election next year, because those House seats are only every 2 years. But there's a tool out there, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, it's called ResistBot. And it's a technology tool, nonprofit that a lot of folks help out with to help you contact your elected officials. Have you heard of it by chance?
No, I haven't.
Okay. So you can choose to use, you can text, you can use Facebook Messenger. There's a whole host of tools that they have. And they make it easier for you to get in contact with your elected officials. But one key thing that they do is at the end you can write your letter, you can hit send, but they ask you a question. They say, do you want us to tweet a copy of the letter you just sent to your elected officials? Which makes it a public record on Twitter. And if you do, they create the tweet, they put an image out there of the letter you just sent, and they tag your elected officials. And it makes it very easy then to do a quick search and see all the letters that are being sent to your elected officials. And the idea that I've done before, and I'm going to present it to authors like yourself, the author that I'm going to talk with on Saturday, and the guys that are running against him, is to catalog and compile these letters that go to these elected officials that are just being silent. They were silent when Trump was doing everything that he was doing. They just shrugged and didn't do a thing about it. But there were endless letters that were inundating their office that they were just basically shredding and putting in File 13 from their constituents that allegedly they were so, rushing and asking for their vote, every election cycle, but yet they just ignore and claim that they're allegedly doing their job. I think that is a very powerful book to compile and create a record and a story to tell there. I'm just curious what your thoughts are now that you've written numerous books there, what you think about a project like that.
I think that's a very good idea. The question that I would have is how impactful will that be? And one of the things that in looking at the elections is that, most of the congressional districts are either very solidly Republican or very solidly Democrat. And Marjorie Greene, for example, got 85% of the vote in her district. And I'm sure that Barry Loudermilk got probably 55 or 60% of the vote. And so I think that what the Democrats got to do, and I think Biden's doing it now, and I think it's exactly what he needs to do, is that you just got to keep hammering away of what he's doing for the people in terms of spending, in terms of getting rid of the pandemic, in terms of the economy, in terms of building the infrastructure. And I don't know whether or not, even if people saw social media and tweets that said that there's a problem with what the Republicans are saying, that would affect people. I think people are. It amazes me that there was no red line that Trump could cross, and even the January 6th insurrection, I would have thought, well, that would have been the red line when people and voters still need to would say, hey, we're not going to support Trump because he wants to overthrow democracy. And if anything, that's even strengthened Trump's case, because Trump said that this is based on the premise that the election was fair. And he said the election was a big lie, and 70% of the Republicans believe that it was a fraudulent result. And so if somebody believes that it's a fraudulent result, how are you going to convince them that Trump is wrong, no matter what you say? That's what I find amazing, is that people still support the man regardless of what he does or says.
True. And the decision this week, I think, definitely is a nail in its coffin for him to not be re-added to Facebook. And then, he continues to not be allowed back on Twitter. Because, and I've mentioned this in previous episodes as well, you had reporters that would literally chomping at the bit, staring at their screen, waiting on him to tweet something new and ridiculous. You don't have that right now, thankfully. And it would have been that way if he were to have been allowed back on Facebook or a mainstream social media platform. So
I'm only laughing because there was an analysis that the Washington Post did, which showed that during Biden's first 100 days, he made 67 false and misleading statements. And you compared that to Trump. Trump made 511. Trump made 8 times as many false and misleading statements. And over his entire 4 years, he made over 30,000 false and misleading statements. And still that doesn't affect the base of the Republican Party, which again is incredible.
Yeah. It's every little bit helps, though. I mean, there's even tools that are out there. I don't know if you've seen the website that how to enable child lock to disable Fox News at your parents' home.
Yeah.
These are the tools, but Fox News with the lawsuits that they were getting after the election companies were suing them, they've even toned their stuff down because they were worried about losing money over all the trash that they were spewing out. So it's
and it's still amazing that they continue. They would not cover. This is part of the media. Fox News. Joe Biden had a speech today in where was it? In Louisiana. That's right. And it was about his new program. Fox News wouldn't even cover it.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, all the conservatives that just watch Fox News would not even hear anything about it. And thank God that Facebook, that the panel that oversees that, would not allow Trump to get back on Facebook, because I think that would have been horrendous. And the more that he's kept off, the better off we are.
Yeah. Well, all that was blown out of the water back in the 80s. The Reagan administration blew the fairness doctrine out of the water back in the 80s. Back when you had a normal newscast, and if there was something political or controversial, you had to air both sides of the story. They don't do that anymore. That's not been done since the 80s. So, yeah.
And what's interesting is that I've got a number of friends who are very conservative, and I'll send them articles from CNN, from ABC, and they'll send me articles from The Beast and from Bumblebee and from other sites that I've never even heard of, and stories that I've never even heard of. And it's almost like there are two different versions of reality that are going on now. And despite what they say, you can pick your own opinion, you just can't pick which facts you use to support it. But people are looking at the same situation and coming to very different conclusions based upon the alternate worlds that they live in.
For sure. And it's in the corporate world, it's a lot of similar stuff that we talk about with unconscious bias. And when situations they don't affect you, you just shrug and you're like, well, you don't care about them until, as you mentioned with your character in the book there, until your cleaning lady gets locked up or something like that. Oh, well, then it suddenly affects you. So it certainly is something to think about for sure.
The other thing is that you also get into this moral dilemma that there's one character in the book who's an inspector general for the Justice Department, and people start coming to him and saying, hey, there's all this illegal stuff going on that's benefiting Trump supporters, and we want you to do something. And as the inspector general, that's his job, and he says, but if I do it, then I'm going to be fired. And Trump fired 5 or 6 inspector generals during his term, and so this guy figures, well, if I do my job and investigate some of Trump's associates, A, nothing's going to happen, and B, I'll get fired from my job. So therefore, why should I do it? But if I don't do it, then, can I live with myself? And this is kind of the moral dilemma that people would have been faced with in a Trump second term of, do I do something which will have no impact and then lose my livelihood, or do I do something and risk not having a job? And those are the kinds of tough decisions that in the abstract, everybody is gung-ho for morality and gung-ho doing the right thing. But if it costs you your job and costs you your livelihood, are you really going to do it?
Yeah. Do you happen to watch Rachel Maddow very often?
Yeah, I do watch her sometimes, yes.
Yeah. If you might remember, she every time Trump fired somebody, she just started adding them to the tote board. And there was at some point they had to pan out so far that she was just like an inch in the corner of the screen. There were so many people that either fired or just left because of the disaster, the dumpster fire. So, yeah.
But then Trump had the big megaphone, which was Twitter, in order to say this guy is not good. He was overwhelmed, like General Kelly, who was his chief of staff. He said General Kelly was overwhelmed by the position. And one of the things that I had a lot of fun with in the book was that in order to get the voice of Trump, I used Twitter. And so I would get a tweet, and that would be Trump. And if Trump declared a state of national emergency, then he would do it via tweet, which is what he would do. And one of my editors looked at some of the tweets and said, wait a minute, Tom, there are misspellings in them, you're bolding stuff, it's not grammatical. And I said, exactly. Therefore, I have copied Trump's tweets.
Yeah. And I forget the recent episode that I did, and you wonder sometimes whether he does some of this on purpose. Maybe. But if you might remember, there was an interview of Michael Cohen that one time, and Michael Cohen confirmed Trump has no sense of humor. It's literally all him, and everything is what's going to make him more money, what's in it for him, and be damned everything else. And that was true over and over, still to this day.
And it's totally true. But to one of the points that we made throughout this podcast is that his people don't believe it. They accept what he says. And the big lie, and there was a really nice episode where they had a Republican spokesperson being interviewed by a CNN, through either CNN or one of the major networks, saying, do you think that Joe Biden was legitimately elected? And the spokesperson could not use the word legitimate. He said, no, I think the problem is that we had a faulty election. He said, well, but regardless of what you think is a faulty election, do you think that Joe Biden was legitimately elected? And after 8 tries, the Republican spokesperson couldn't use the word legitimacy. I mean, it was amazing to watch, and it almost seemed like an episode. If you had seen it on Saturday Night Live, he would have said that's absurd. But it wasn't on Saturday Night Live; it was an interview.
Oh yeah, yeah. Republicans are. I mean, like Barry Loudermilk, he hasn't done a town hall in years. He is so scared to be confronted, to be asked the tough questions. He's so far in hiding at this point, it's ridiculous.
Well, and the only good news is, because Trump is so far out there, the 2 Georgia senator seats would have gone Republican if Trump had, instead of focusing on getting Perdue and Loeffler reelected, he was more concerned about pushing the big lie and the fact that it was a fraudulent election than getting 2 Republicans elected. So, to a certain extent, I'm saying, hey, thank God he is as off base as he is. Otherwise, he potentially could have won the election, and it would have been a Republican Senate, and that would have been very scary.
Definitely, for sure. Any other parting words or comments from the book or anything else? The other thing, the other note that came out this week, and just to get it on the podcast, since we're talking about Barry Loudermilk, years ago when Barry Loudermilk was trying to get elected, Josh Duggar, does that name sound familiar to you?
Sure. Yeah, he was 19 and counting or something?
Yeah. So as another side gig, part of the whole reality thing they were doing at the time, he was going around with Republicans and helping them get elected. And there was an event up in Woodstock, Georgia, that he helped Barry Loudermilk get out the vote. And this event, which I'm amazed to this day, has not been removed from Barry Loudermilk's campaign Facebook page, has the Duggars and Barry Loudermilk campaigning together. Well, fast forward to this week, Josh Duggar has been let out on bail because he is still in trouble for child pornography. Another reason that Barry Loudermilk is in hiding and not wanting to do town halls, I'm certain.
But even if you look at Matt Gaetz and you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene, both of whom have extreme views, and there are accusations against Matt Gaetz, and still the Republican Party has not sanctioned either one of them.
No.
And, I think when you look at what Liz Cheney had said, you need to remember, you need to figure out where you stood on these issues and where your conscience is when these issues were raised. And the Republican Party has clearly made a stance, and that's why it's critically important that as I'm thinking about the election and people say, well, hey, 155 million people vote, does my vote count? And given 105,000 votes separated Trump from Biden at the end in terms of getting elected, I'm thinking, yeah, every vote counts. And the lesson of the book and kind of, final learning is that once a president gets elected, you, for all intents and purposes, you're not going to get rid of him. And he's not going to be assassinated, most likely. He's not going to be removed by the legislature. The courts are not going to remove him. So America needs to be really wise on its choices, and thank God that they made the choice that they did in 2020.
Certainly agreed. Well, thanks, Tom, for joining. Was there anything else you want to get added in on this episode?
No, I enjoyed it, Robert. And my book, Trump's Second Term, What If President Donald J. Trump Had Won Re-Election 2020, is available on Amazon in either soft paper or ebook.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for joining, and we'll get this published out. Thanks for have a good week there. It's beautiful out, finally, after that storm came through.
Thank good. It's always beautiful in Georgia, and I'm coming down from New York. I always used to say that northern by birth, southern by the grace of God.
All right, glad to have you. Have a good rest of the week.
Thanks, Robert.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.